Picture this: Hollywood's biggest stars earning millions per picture, living in mansions, driving luxury cars, then losing it all at the poker table. The golden age of Hollywood wasn't just about glamour and stardom. It was also about devastating gambling addictions that destroyed legends. These weren't just bad bets. These were complete financial catastrophes that left some of cinema's greatest icons penniless and broken. Which beloved star had the mafia hunting him down for unpaid debts? Let's find out. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was Hollywood's golden boy, literally. In 1941, he was the industry's top earner, pulling in more money than Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and Spencer Tracy combined. The pint-sized powerhouse who charmed audiences as Andy Hardy was making bank, but he was also bleeding money faster than a gunshot wound. Rooney's gambling addiction was legendary, even by Hollywood standards. He'd hit the racetracks, casinos, and underground poker games with the same manic energy he brought to his performances. The guy who played America's wholesome teenager was anything but wholesome behind the scenes. Rooney was Hollywood's top earner in 1941, but blew his fortune on women and gambling as quickly as he earned it. The mafia wanted him dead as he racked up huge debts. Think about that for a second. The mafia wanted Mickey Rooney dead. The same guy who made audiences laugh and cry in 16 Andy Hardy films had organized crime breathing down his neck. His gambling wasn't just recreational, it was compulsive, destructive, and nearly fatal. Rooney would bet on anything: horses, cards, dice, you name it. He'd walk into a casino with a studio paycheck and walk out with nothing but IOUs. The financial devastation was staggering. Despite earning millions throughout his career, Rooney found himself taking smaller roles in B-movies just to pay off gambling debts. Eventually, Rooney overcame years of gambling and alcohol abuse through a newfound devotion to Christianity and the marriage to his eighth and final wife, Jan Chamberlain, in 1978. By the 1970s, Rooney was performing in Las Vegas, ironically surrounded by the very temptations that had destroyed his fortune. He eventually got clean, but the damage was done. The man who should have been worth hundreds of millions died with virtually nothing in his estate. Mickey Rooney's story is a perfect example of how talent and success mean absolutely nothing when addiction takes the wheel. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn swashbuckled his way across movie screens, but his real-life adventures at the gambling tables were far more dangerous than anything he faced on camera. The Australian-born actor who made sword fighting look effortless couldn't master the art of knowing when to fold. Flynn's gambling started early and escalated quickly. He'd bet on everything: horse races, poker games, even dice games with crew members between takes. The man who played Robin Hood was robbing himself blind, one bet at a time. Flynn's appetite for risk wasn't limited to his legendary love affairs. He was equally reckless with his money. The actor's gambling losses were astronomical. Flynn would receive massive paychecks for films like The Adventures of Robin Hood and Captain Blood, then promptly lose them in high-stakes poker games in Hollywood's underground scene. He frequented illegal gambling dens where studio executives, directors, and fellow actors would gather to play for amounts that could buy houses. Flynn's addiction became so severe that Warner Brothers studio executives had to intervene. They'd often pay his gambling debts directly to keep their star out of trouble with dangerous creditors. But Flynn saw this as enabling rather than helping, and he'd return to the tables within days of being bailed out. The consequences went beyond money. Flynn's gambling addiction strained his relationships, destroyed his marriages, and contributed to his reputation as Hollywood's bad boy. He'd disappear for days, missing filming schedules and costing studios thousands in production delays. Directors learned to shoot around Flynn's absences, knowing he was likely holed up in some backroom poker game. By the time Flynn died in 1959 at age 50, his estate was a mess of unpaid debts and legal troubles. The man who'd earned millions playing heroes died nearly broke, his fortune scattered across poker tables and racetracks. Flynn proved that even the most charming rogue couldn't charm his way out of gambling addiction. George Raft. George Raft looked like he belonged in a casino, slicked back hair, sharp suits, and that cold stare that made him perfect for gangster roles. Unfortunately, Raft didn't just play tough guys, he gambled like one too, and it cost him everything. Raft's gambling addiction was as smooth and dangerous as his on-screen persona. He'd roll into Las Vegas or Atlantic City with the confidence of a man who owned the place, dropping thousands on single hands of blackjack or spins of the roulette wheel. The actor who made a career out of playing criminals was committing financial suicide one bet at a time. What made Raft's story particularly tragic was his success. He was one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors in the 1930s and 1940s, commanding enormous salaries for films like Scarface and Each Dawn I Die. But success meant nothing when he couldn't resist the tables. Raft would finish filming a picture, collect his paycheck, and head straight to the nearest casino. The actor's gambling wasn't just about money, it was about image. Raft cultivated relationships with real mobsters, partly for his film roles, but mostly because he was genuinely fascinated by their world. He'd gamble with dangerous men who didn't accept IOUs, putting himself in potentially lethal situations. Studio executives worried constantly about their stars' safety. Raft's addiction became so notorious that casinos would comp him everything: rooms, meals, entertainment, knowing he'd lose it all back at the tables anyway. He was what gamblers call a whale, a high roller who brings in massive action. But unlike smart whales, Raft never knew when to quit. By the 1950s, Raft's career was declining, but his gambling wasn't. He'd take smaller roles just to fund his addiction, performing in B-movies and television shows. The man who'd once commanded six-figure salaries was working for scale just to keep playing. Raft's story is a masterclass in how gambling can turn success into failure faster than you can say, place your bets. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra didn't just sing about luck, he bet on it, and lost big. The chairman of the board was also the chairman of some of the most expensive gambling losses in Hollywood history. Sinatra's relationship with gambling was as complex as his relationship with the mob, and just as dangerous. Sinatra's gambling wasn't recreational, it was compulsive. Stars like Frank Sinatra, Humphrey Bogart, and Cary Grant were well-known gamblers who frequented both legal casinos and illicit speakeasies. But Sinatra took it to another level. He'd bet on everything: horses, dice, cards, even baseball games. The man who could make audiences swoon with My Way was losing his way at the tables. What made Sinatra's gambling particularly destructive was his access. As the leader of the Rat Pack, he had unlimited credit at Las Vegas casinos. Owners would compensate him for everything, knowing he'd lose massive amounts. Sinatra would perform at the Copa Room, then head straight to the casino floor for all-night gambling sessions that could cost him hundreds of thousands. The financial damage was staggering. Despite earning millions from records, films, and live performances, Sinatra was constantly in debt. He'd lose more in a single night than most people earned in a lifetime. His gambling losses were so severe that he'd sometimes have to take recording contracts or film roles just to pay off casino debts. Sinatra's addiction affected more than his wallet. His gambling created tension with his wives, strained his friendships, and complicated his already murky relationships with organized crime figures. When you owe money to the wrong people in Las Vegas, the consequences can be permanent. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. Sinatra sang about doing things my way, but when it came to gambling, he was doing things the addiction's way. He'd win occasionally, sometimes spectacularly, but those wins only fueled his compulsion to bet bigger and risk more. Even in his later years, when his voice was failing and his film career was winding down, Sinatra couldn't resist the tables. The man who'd conquered entertainment never conquered his gambling demons. Dean Martin. Dean Martin was cool incarnate, smooth voice, effortless charm, and a martini always in hand. But behind that laid-back persona was a gambling addiction that was anything but cool. Martin's losses at the tables were as impressive as his performances on stage, and twice as devastating. Martin's gambling style matched his personality. He made it look easy, even when he was losing his shirt. The man who crooned, "Ain't that a kick in the head," was getting kicked in the wallet nightly. Martin would saunter into Las Vegas casinos with that signature swagger, order a drink, and proceed to lose astronomical amounts with the same casual attitude he brought to everything else. What made Martin's gambling particularly dangerous was his friendship with Frank Sinatra. The two Rat Pack members would egg each other on, turning gambling into a competition. They'd bet on who could lose more money, who could stay at the tables longer, and who could handle the losses better. It was a toxic friendship that enabled both men's addictions. Martin's favorite games were craps and blackjack, and he was legendarily bad at both. Casino employees would smile when Martin approached the tables, knowing they were about to make serious money. He'd bet maximum amounts on terrible odds, seemingly oblivious to basic gambling strategy. The man who was brilliant at comedy was clueless about cards. The financial consequences were severe. Martin earned millions from his recording career, television shows, and films, but he was constantly borrowing money to cover gambling debts. His business manager would hide money from him, knowing Martin would immediately lose it if he had access. Martin's gambling addiction contributed to his reputation as a drunk, though he was actually drinking less than people thought. The real intoxication was gambling, and Martin was drunk on the action. He'd gamble until sunrise, stumble home, then return to the casino the next day. Dean Martin proved that even the coolest cats can get burned by gambling fever. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was the ultimate entertainer. He could sing, dance, act, and do impressions that left audiences breathless. But his most impressive performance was making millions of dollars disappear at gambling tables. Davis didn't just entertain audiences. He entertained some of the most expensive gambling habits in Hollywood history. Davis's gambling addiction was fueled by his need to prove himself. As the only black member of the Rat Pack, he felt pressure to keep up with his wealthy white friends. When Sinatra and Martin dropped thousands at the tables, Davis felt compelled to match them, even when he couldn't afford it. This toxic combination of addiction and insecurity created a financial disaster. The entertainer's gambling losses were legendary. Davis would perform at the Copa Room, earning thousands, then lose it all within hours at the blackjack tables. He'd bet on sports, play poker, and hit the roulette wheel with equal enthusiasm and equally disastrous results. Davis treated gambling like another form of entertainment, except this entertainment was bankrupting him. What made Davis's situation particularly tragic was his earning power. He was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world, commanding enormous fees for performances, recordings, and television appearances. But success meant nothing when he'd lose more than he earned. Davis would sometimes perform multiple shows in a single night, desperately trying to fund his gambling addiction. The financial pressure was enormous. Davis owed money to casinos, loan sharks, and the IRS simultaneously. He'd take any gig that paid well, performing at venues he normally wouldn't consider. The man who'd conquered Broadway and Hollywood was reduced to playing smaller venues just to cover gambling debts. Davis's addiction affected his health and relationships. The stress of constant debt contributed to his chain smoking and drinking, both of which ultimately killed him. When Davis died in 1990, he left behind a massive debt that his family struggled to pay off. The man who'd given everything to entertain others had gambled away everything for himself. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was one of Hollywood's most beautiful women, but her gambling addiction was ugly as sin. The sultry star who mesmerized audiences in films like The Killers and Mogambo was killing her bank account one bet at a time. Gardner's losses at the tables were as dramatic as her performances on screen. Gardner's gambling wasn't just about money. It was about thrill-seeking. The actress who lived life on her own terms extended that philosophy to the casino floor, where she'd bet recklessly on everything from poker to horse racing. Gardner treated gambling like another form of rebellion, except this rebellion cost her millions. The actress's gambling style was as passionate as her love affairs. She'd bet with the same intensity she brought to her relationships with Frank Sinatra and Mickey Rooney. Gardner would play all night, fueled by cigarettes and alcohol, making increasingly desperate bets as her losses mounted. She was beautiful, but her gambling was beautifully destructive. What made Gardner's situation particularly sad was her lack of business sense. Unlike some stars who had managers protecting their money, Gardner had direct access to her earnings. She'd cash movie paychecks and head straight to the nearest casino, treating her career like a gambling bankroll. The woman who was smart enough to navigate Hollywood's politics was clueless about managing money. Gardner's gambling addiction coincided with her declining career. As she aged and film roles became scarcer, her gambling became more desperate. She'd take smaller parts in European films, often just to fund her addiction. The actress who'd once commanded top dollar was working for scale just to keep playing. The consequences extended beyond money. Gardner's gambling strained her relationships and contributed to her reputation as difficult to work with. Directors learned to schedule around her gambling, knowing she might disappear for days. Ava Gardner proved that even the most beautiful women can make ugly financial decisions. Rita Hayworth was America's love goddess, the pinup queen who drove men wild with her beauty and dancing. But Hayworth's real obsession wasn't men, it was gambling, and it drove her to financial ruin. The star who made Gilda unforgettable forgot how to manage her own money. Hayworth's gambling addiction developed gradually, starting with casual bets on horse races and evolving into a full-blown casino addiction. The actress who could make any dance move look effortless found herself stumbling through increasingly desperate gambling sessions. She'd bet on anything: cards, dice, sports, even casino games she didn't understand. What made Hayworth's gambling particularly tragic was her vulnerability. The actress struggled with personal relationships and used gambling as an emotional escape. When her marriages failed or her career stalled, she'd flee to Las Vegas or Atlantic City, seeking comfort in the mindless repetition of slot machines and card games. Gambling became her drug of choice. The financial damage was severe. Hayworth earned millions during her peak years, but she was losing even more at the tables. She'd receive studio paychecks and immediately convert them to gambling chips. The woman who was brilliant at memorizing dance routines couldn't remember basic gambling odds. She'd make the same mistakes repeatedly, always convinced the next bet would be different. Hayworth's addiction coincided with her declining mental health. As she aged and developed what would later be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, her gambling became more erratic and expensive. She'd forget how much she'd lost, forget what games she was playing, and forget why she was even at the casino. It was heartbreaking to watch. The consequences were devastating. Hayworth's gambling addiction contributed to her financial problems in later life. The woman who'd been one of Hollywood's highest-paid stars ended up struggling to pay basic bills. Her gambling had consumed not just her money, but her dignity and peace of mind. Rita Hayworth's story is a reminder that even the most beautiful and talented people can fall victim to gambling addiction. John Huston was a master filmmaker who directed classics like The Maltese Falcon and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. But Huston's real treasure hunt was at the gambling tables, where he lost fortunes that would make even his fictional characters weep. The man who understood story structure couldn't structure his own financial life. Huston's gambling addiction was as legendary as his filmmaking. He'd bet on everything: horses, cards, dice, even the outcome of his own films. The director who could spot a bad script from a mile away was blind to bad gambling odds. Huston would finish directing a major Hollywood production, collect his fee, and immediately lose it all at the racetrack. What made Huston's gambling particularly expensive was his taste for high-stakes action. He wasn't content with small bets. He wanted the thrill of risking everything. Huston would bet amounts that could finance entire films, treating gambling like another form of creative expression. The man who was brilliant at managing million-dollar budgets was terrible at managing his own money. The director's gambling losses were so severe that he'd sometimes have to take directing jobs just to pay off debts. Huston would agree to direct films he wasn't passionate about, using his artistic talent to fund his gambling addiction. The man who'd created cinematic masterpieces was reduced to making movies for money rather than art. Huston's addiction affected his relationships and career. Actors and producers learned to advance him money carefully, knowing he'd lose it before filming began. His gambling created tension on sets, as crew members watched their director disappear between takes to check racing results or place bets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. Huston directed films about greed and human weakness, but he couldn't overcome his own weaknesses. He understood character motivation on screen, but couldn't understand his own motivation at the tables. John Huston proved that even the most insightful directors can be blind to their own problems. William Holden. William Holden was Hollywood's golden boy, the handsome leading man who starred in classics like Sunset Boulevard and The Bridge on the River Kwai. But Holden's real drama was playing out at gambling tables, where he was losing millions with the same intensity he brought to his performances. Holden's gambling addiction started innocently enough with casual poker games and horse race betting, but the actor who was brilliant at reading scripts was terrible at reading poker tells. He'd bet recklessly, convinced that his next hand would be the winner. Holden treated gambling like method acting. He'd completely immerse himself in the role of a high roller. What made Holden's gambling particularly destructive was his competitive nature. The actor who'd won an Oscar for Stalag 17 was determined to win at the tables too. He'd chase losses with bigger bets, convinced that his luck would eventually turn. Holden would play all night, fueled by alcohol and desperation, making increasingly poor decisions. The financial consequences were staggering. Holden earned millions during his peak years, but he was losing even more at casinos and racetracks. He'd receive studio paychecks and immediately convert them to gambling chips. The man who was disciplined enough to maintain his physique for action roles couldn't maintain financial discipline. Holden's addiction affected his career choices. He'd take roles in inferior films just to fund his gambling, diluting his brand and reputation. The actor who'd been selective about projects became desperate for any paying work. Directors and producers learned to pay Holden carefully, knowing he'd lose advances before filming began. The personal toll was enormous. Holden's gambling strained his relationships and contributed to his drinking problem. He'd disappear for days, holed up in casinos, missing family events and professional commitments. The man who'd portrayed complex characters on screen was becoming a cliché in real life. Another talented actor destroyed by addiction. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was Hollywood's bad boy, the sleepy-eyed actor who made rebellion look effortless. But Mitchum's real rebellion was against his own financial stability, and he was losing that fight spectacularly. The man who could make any character look cool was making gambling look expensive. Mitchum's gambling addiction fit his persona perfectly. He was laid back about losing money, treating massive losses like minor inconveniences. The actor who'd survived marijuana arrests and studio suspensions couldn't survive his own gambling habits. Mitchum would bet on anything with the same casual attitude he brought to everything else. What made Mitchum's gambling particularly dangerous was his fatalistic attitude. The actor who'd built a career on playing characters who didn't care about consequences applied the same philosophy to gambling. He'd lose enormous amounts without flinching, convinced that money was just paper and luck was just luck. The financial damage was severe. Mitchum earned millions during his career, but he was losing it as fast as he earned it. He'd finish filming a major picture, collect his paycheck, and immediately head to the nearest casino or racetrack. The man who was brilliant at creating memorable characters was terrible at creating financial memories. Mitchum's addiction was enabled by his success. Studios would advance him money, knowing he'd lose it, but also knowing he'd show up for work. The actor's professionalism on set contrasted sharply with his irresponsibility at the tables. He'd memorize lines perfectly but couldn't remember basic gambling odds. The consequences extended beyond money. Mitchum's gambling contributed to his reputation as unreliable, even though he was actually one of Hollywood's most dependable actors. His gambling losses created financial pressure that forced him to take roles he didn't want, diluting his artistic legacy. Robert Mitchum's story proves that even the coolest actors can make hot-headed financial decisions. His gambling addiction was as self-destructive as any character he ever played. Bert Lancaster. Bert Lancaster was Hollywood's athletic hero, the former circus performer who brought physical intensity to every role. But Lancaster's most intense performance was at the gambling tables, where he was losing millions with the same determination he brought to his acrobatics. Lancaster's gambling addiction developed from his competitive nature. The actor who'd performed death-defying circus stunts was attracted to the high-stakes risk of gambling. He'd bet on sports, play poker, and hit the casinos with the same physical intensity he brought to his film roles. Lancaster treated gambling like another form of athletic competition. What made Lancaster's gambling particularly expensive was his inability to quit while ahead. The actor who was disciplined enough to maintain his physique throughout his career couldn't maintain financial discipline. He'd win occasionally, sometimes spectacularly, but those wins only fueled his compulsion to bet bigger and risk more. The financial consequences were severe. Lancaster earned millions during his peak years, but he was losing even more at the tables. He'd receive studio paychecks and immediately convert them to gambling chips. The man who was smart enough to form his own production company was stupid about managing his gambling losses. Lancaster's addiction affected his business relationships. The actor who'd been successful at negotiating film contracts was terrible at negotiating with bookmakers and casino owners. He'd make deals he couldn't keep, promising to pay gambling debts with future earnings that he'd inevitably lose before collecting. The personal toll was enormous. Lancaster's gambling strained his relationships and created financial pressure that lasted throughout his career. He'd take roles in inferior films just to fund his addiction, diluting his artistic legacy. The man who'd been selective about projects became desperate for any paying work. Bert Lancaster's story is a reminder that physical strength means nothing when you're weak at the tables. His gambling addiction proved that even the most disciplined performers can lose control when addiction takes over. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas was Hollywood's warrior, the intense actor who brought passion to every role. But Douglas's real battle was with gambling addiction, and he was losing that war one bet at a time. The man who'd conquered sword and sandal epics couldn't conquer his own compulsions. Douglas's gambling addiction was as dramatic as his acting style. He'd bet with the same intensity he brought to roles like Spartacus, treating every hand of poker like a life-or-death struggle. The actor who was brilliant at memorizing dialogue was terrible at remembering gambling odds. Douglas would chase losses with bigger bets, convinced that his next wager would be victorious. What made Douglas's gambling particularly destructive was his ego. The actor who'd built a career on playing strong, determined characters couldn't admit he was weak at the tables. He'd continue playing long after he should have quit, his pride preventing him from walking away from losing streaks. The financial damage was staggering. Douglas earned millions during his peak years, but he was losing it as fast as he earned it. He'd finish filming a major production, collect his fee, and immediately head to Las Vegas or Atlantic City. The man who was disciplined enough to produce his own films was undisciplined about managing his gambling losses. Douglas's addiction affected his business decisions. The actor who'd been smart enough to turn down roles that didn't suit him was making terrible decisions at the tables. He'd bet on sports he didn't understand, play games he couldn't win, and trust his luck more than his intelligence. The consequences extended beyond money. Douglas's gambling created tension in his personal relationships and forced him to take roles just to pay off debts. The actor who'd been selective about projects became desperate for any paying work. His gambling losses influenced his career choices for decades. Kirk Douglas's story proves that even the strongest screen warriors can be defeated by gambling addiction. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was Hollywood's heartthrob, the handsome actor who charmed audiences in films like Some Like It Hot. But Curtis's real hot streak was at the gambling tables, where he was losing millions with the same charm he brought to his performances. The man who could make any woman swoon was making bookmakers rich. Curtis's gambling addiction started with casual bets on horse races and evolved into a full-blown casino addiction. The actor who was brilliant at comedy was seriously bad at cards. He'd bet recklessly, convinced that his charm would translate to gambling luck. Curtis treated every bet like a performance, expecting applause even when he lost. What made Curtis's gambling particularly expensive was his celebrity status. Casinos would comp him everything: rooms, meals, entertainment, knowing he'd lose it all back at the tables. The actor who was smart enough to negotiate million-dollar film contracts was stupid about gambling odds. He'd make the same mistakes repeatedly, always convinced the next bet would be different. The financial consequences were severe. Curtis earned millions during his peak years, but he was losing even more at the tables. He'd receive studio paychecks and immediately convert them to gambling chips. The man who was disciplined enough to maintain his leading man looks couldn't maintain financial discipline. Curtis's addiction affected his career choices. He'd take roles in inferior films just to fund his gambling, diluting his brand and reputation. The actor who'd been selective about projects became desperate for any paying work. Directors and producers learned to pay Curtis carefully, knowing he'd lose advances before filming began. The personal toll was enormous. Curtis's gambling strained his relationships and contributed to his multiple divorces. He'd disappear for days, holed up in casinos, missing family events and professional commitments. The man who'd portrayed charming characters on screen was becoming a cautionary tale in real life. Tony Curtis proved that even the most charming actors can make charmless financial decisions. Peter Lofford was Hollywood's English gentleman, the sophisticated actor who became a key member of the Rat Pack. But Lofford's real sophistication was in losing money, and he was losing it with the same elegance he brought to his performances. The man who'd married into the Kennedy family was divorcing himself from financial stability. Lofford's gambling addiction was enabled by his Rat Pack membership. Surrounded by Sinatra, Martin, and Davis, all of whom had expensive gambling habits, Lofford felt pressure to keep up. The actor who was brilliant at playing sophisticated characters was unsophisticated about managing money. He'd bet on everything with the same casual attitude he brought to cocktail parties. What made Lofford's gambling particularly tragic was his dependency on others. Unlike his Rat Pack colleagues, who had substantial independent incomes, Lofford was increasingly dependent on his famous friends for financial support. His gambling losses created a cycle of debt and dependency that undermined his self-respect and professional reputation. The financial damage was devastating. Lofford earned millions during his peak years, but he was losing it all at the tables. He'd receive paychecks from television shows and films, then immediately lose them at casinos. The man who was smart enough to navigate Hollywood politics was clueless about gambling strategy. Lofford's addiction coincided with his declining career. As his acting opportunities decreased, his gambling became more desperate. He'd take smaller roles in B-movies, often just to fund his addiction. The actor who'd once starred in major MGM productions was reduced to appearing in low-budget films. The consequences extended beyond money. Lofford's gambling contributed to his divorce from Patricia Kennedy, severing his connection to America's most famous political family. His addiction strained his friendships within the Rat Pack and created professional problems that lasted throughout his career. Peter Lofford's story is a reminder that even the most sophisticated actors can make unsophisticated financial decisions. His gambling addiction proved that charm and connections mean nothing when you're addicted to losing money. These 15 legends proved that talent, wealth, and fame mean absolutely nothing when gambling addiction takes control. From Mickey Rooney's mafia troubles to Sinatra's casino connections, these stars lost everything that mattered. Their stories remind us that addiction doesn't discriminate. It destroys lives regardless of status or success. Which story shocked you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's dark side, smash that subscribe button for more untold stories about cinema's greatest legends.